Welcome to Project Management, module number 2. So we finished up forecasting, and forecasting was very important because we need to know what do we expect future prices, future demand, future sales to be, right? I mean, that's sort of our starting point for everything else that we do throughout the entire class is what do we expect the future to look like? That's essentially what forecasting is. Now we move into project management. Now, yeah, project management, sounds really big. We're building buildings, we're building factories, we're doing all this other cool stuff. But project management doesn't have to be that way. Right? It can just be anything. Right? How do you arrange to do a paper? How do you arrange to do, like in the assignments, one of the assignments, do laundry? That's a project, right? So in the general sense, a project is just a set of activities that have a beginning and an end. That's it, right? And so it could be anything. It could be, how do I build a pair of glasses? How do I build a hard drive? How do I build headphones, right? There's a beginning, right? We start off no headphone. We have some raw materials. We put it together in a certain order at certain times. And at the end, we have a product. Right? That is considered a project. So a project is very expansive. So we're kind of flowing from, hey, what do we expect to sell? And we get our mix of products that we expect to sell. And then project management, we kind of flow through, well, how do we make them? How do we arrange them? How do we provide the service? What are the steps involved in providing the service? And that's where we're at now. And then we'll move into constraint management where, hey, we have all these demands and these competing activities, but we have, a scarce amount of resources. Well, how do we allocate those resources in the best way possible? Well, there's constraint management. And then we move from constraint management into inventory management. Okay, well, we're trying to manage those constraints. You're going to need to keep a little bit of inventory so that, we're never idle. Our processes are working all the time to the maximum, sort of the maximum capacity that they possibly can. Okay? And then we talk about waiting lines. Is what happens when things go awry? What happens when things are variable? Right? How do we manage that? Right? So throughout this whole course, we see the whole sequence of operations. And each one of these modules represents a sequence or a very important component in each step of the operations of any provision of any product or any service for that matter. Okay? And now, granted, each one of these topics that we'll deal with is a whole field behind there. Project management is a huge field, right? It's got certifications. My daughter, is a project manager, so she had to go through there's a whole certification process and so on, and rigorous courses, fairly tough exam, lots to know, right? So there's lots within each one of these components. So project management, just something we're doing. It's a set of activities, has a beginning, has an end. That's it, right? Once it fulfills those requirements, it's a project. Now, it's very applied. There's usually a budget. There's money involved. And we want to do these things or do these projects in the most efficient way possible. Usually that means we have a set of criteria or set of activities that we have to do, and we want to do those set of activities in a cost minimizing fashion. Okay? Whilst, again, meeting all customers' specifications, right? So it's a constrained problem. So if you sort of remember the basics of linear programming from your first year math class, Finance 113, soon to be called Management Science 113, in linear programming, essentially that was the issue that we dealt with. Right? So always trying to meet something in the profit maximizing or cost minimizing way, subject to some constraints. Okay, so project is very, very wide open. Okay, and so we're going to learn when we deal with project management is how to arrange these tasks. What are these tasks? Right? I mean, let's start off with the basics as defining what it is that we're going to do, or what are the steps within this project. And that's not trivial. Right? It's kind of thrown out there, but it can be very tricky in an applied sense. And then we define what it is that we need to do, right? The sub steps necessary to complete the project. We organize them, right? Because there's typically an order to these things. You think of writing a research paper, for instance, from your own experience, right? You got to do some initial research, perhaps literature review. Then you sort of look at your materials and see how they fit with your thesis. And of course, you're starting off with what is that your thesis was in the first place, or what it is that you're trying to solve, right? And that's basically the definition of your project. And you go through that process, and then you kind of go through the materials. You see what's important, you see what supports your thesis, what's against your thesis. You address both of those. You put something together. Maybe you have a rough draft. Then you polish it, you adjust it, maybe you change it a little bit depending on what happens within the project, right? And that's, there's your project. And that's maybe a little project, but it is a project. Fancier examples are, adding new factories and new computer systems and new server systems and setting up server farms and all that kind of good stuff. That's, really cool, but project doesn't have to necessarily be that fancy. Okay, so one of the important things is, and you probably encountered this in your university career, is we have to be very careful in defining what's called the scope and objectives. Right? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And we want to define that appropriately, because if we don't define this properly and with sufficient detail, we can be subject to something that's called scope creep, right? We start doing one thing, and then we kind of drift off. Oh, wouldn't this be cool if we did this, or we added this? Or, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we did this and we added that, we tweaked this, and we changed our mind on this, and so on, right? Scope creep is definitely one of the biggest enemies of any project. And when you read in the news or online, hey, this project, this hospital, this school, this building went way over budget and it's behind schedule, often if you look deep enough, scope creep. Right? They changed their minds. They started, adjusting the project on the go because the client, usually the government, didn't have a very firm idea of what exactly they wanted, or they sort of wanted something, but they didn't really specify that appropriately. And next thing you know, things are changing. And when you have to do changes midway through a project or partway through a project, it gets very, very expensive. There is this thing called a change order. And that is the two nastiest words in any project manager's existence. Ooh, we have to do a change order. Because what's happened with the change order? You've put your project out for bid, let's say. And there's a competition for your project, and at that point, you have some control, right? They're bidding. There's adjustments to the price. Price is a consideration, and then you award the contract. Well, essentially, once you've awarded that project contract, whoever you award it to is now a monopolist, right? We've gone from a competitive environment to you only have one provider, right? Your project management or whoever you hired. So you want to have everything all set out and specified properly, right? So that the other party can't abuse that monopoly position. Well, by abuse, can't use that monopoly position against you. However, when you go to do a change order, you want to change something because of scope creep, or you made a mistake, or you didn't properly specify the project, and it turns out you need one thing when you specified the other. Well, the other party is there's no bidding process. You're stuck. They're the monopolist. They dictate the price. I mean, if you don't like the price, then what do you do, right? You don't have a lot of bargaining power. So, change orders, scope creep, ugh, those are nasty things. Great if you're the one benefiting from it. Very bad if you're the client. Okay, so we want to make sure we get those projects properly specified, and can't emphasize that enough. How tremendously important it is. Okay. So there's, we got sort of the formalized process, and there's 5 steps, and we'll talk about some of them, and we'll do others. Like I said, there's a whole field in this. So project management is a whole field in and of itself, and we're just going to dip our toe a little bit into it. So the first step is we need to define what it is that we're doing, right? The work breakdown structure, the detailed tasks that we want to do. Then we get to do a little bit of art. We're going to diagram things up, do some scheduling, right? Because typically whenever we're doing something, we're making a calculator or making a phone, making a coffee cup, right? There's a process, there's an order, right? There's an order to things, and things have to happen at certain stages of that process and at certain times. You don't want to have too much time between each of the stages, because then you're inventorying things, and that costs us money, that eats up working capital, and we typically don't like that. So scheduling is important. But throughout this whole process, and even throughout this whole course, right, we are always dealing with trade-offs, right? I mean, by maybe minimizing inventory, we're causing another problem to happen, right? By doing things faster, that may cost us more money, because we need to have more we have to employ more labor or more equipment, or our machine or our equipment wears out faster because it's working harder. And so we balance that off with, well, if we can get this done earlier, perhaps there's a bonus or a happier client or possible future business. And so we're really assessing and sort of balancing things all the time. It's always a manner of trade-offs. Right? So it can be a complex structure that way. And then at the very end, we won't get into the details of this in this course, but it's important to consider in an actual project is we have to assess the risks, the things that could possibly go wrong. What could happen at each one of those particular tasks that we have to do that may sort of cause trouble for our project, whether it incurs extra cost, it results in us taking longer, and so on. Okay, so I mean, right now, as we talk, I'm involved with a project where we're updating a computer server, and so we're introducing a whole new server system to replace the older server system. Well, we got COVID hitting us from one way or another. Our source for the equipment is trying to put things together, but they're sort of having to deal with some of the programming and the fact that on their end things are getting delayed. On our end, of course, we're dealing with a variety of shutdowns on the Alberta client side. And so there's just a whole mix of issues that are going on, and you turn out, okay, well, you're expecting stuff to ship in early January 2021. Well, this and this happened. Okay, well, let's go with maybe mid-January 20. Well, I mean, somebody needs to just tweak this, and there was an issue with that, right? Now it's, you're looking at end of January 2021, right? And meanwhile, on the other end, the client is dealing with, shutdowns and reduced capacity on its side in Alberta. So there's lots of things, lots of potential risks that go into when things happen. Okay, so that first step is where we define the work breakdown structure, and that's, kind of sounds kind of easy to do. You just, hey, what do you have to do? But it depends on, it can get tricky into how detailed a breakdown do you need to employ. Too much detail and the project is overwhelming. Not enough detail, and you haven't really properly specified that tasks, because in many cases, each one of those breakdowns, or each one of those particular activities, could be its own project, right, with a subcontractor, or with it, with its own entity that provides that service to the project manager, right? So each one of those tasks could be in and of itself its own project. So we have to make sure that we've properly specified that task within the overall whole of the project, so that nothing gets missed, because of course we don't want that whole issue of the change order and scope creep and all that kind of nasty business. And we got to make sure that there's a flow there. It's a timing issue, right? If I'm building a coffee mug, well, I start off with maybe making the mug part. I don't start off coloring the mug, or painting the mug, or glazing the mug, right? There's a process, right? And there's an order to the process. That order is important. I mean, just think of making a peanut butter and jam sandwich. Elementary school, when I was in grade 6, our instructor, I don't even remember the subject, but hey, how would you describe to somebody how to make a peanut butter and jam sandwich? So you got to have all the tasks out. And he brought out, he brought the peanut butter, he brought the jam, he brought the bread and everything, and we wrote out the task list, and he followed it right to the letter, and it was hilarious. You're missing a step because you took that step for granted, and it really forced you to focus in on your explanation to make sure your explanation was sufficient. I mean, there's always set understandings and set jargon in any of these, so you don't have to be silly about it, but you do have to make sure you cover the obvious basics, because sometimes the obvious stuff is not always obvious. Okay. So when we go to diagram this, and so we've got our set of activities, and we know our sequencing, and we know how long things are expected to take. Again, there's a chance that how long they actually do take can vary, and we'll deal with issues, calculations related to what happens if they change. So we have our diagram, and so we have our diagram of our. It's called a network. It's called a network diagram, and it's based on what's called PERT and CPM. So this kind of came out of I think it's the immediate Cold War, 50s, 60s era, in designing tasks, mostly related to, I think, nuclear weapons or something like that. Okay, so we have our program evaluation review technique, or PERT, and the critical path method. Okay. Critical path will be extremely important to us. Okay, now why do we want a diagram? Well, diagrams are is useful for us because it shows us humans are a visual species, and gives us a nice overview of the interrelationships between all the project tasks. Okay, so between all the activities within the project, it represent it in a nice whole. It also helps us determine a couple of things as well. It helps us to, once we have those tasks set out, the sequencing set out, we can determine how long do we expect the project to take. We can determine which activities are the most important, right? Those that really are driving how long this project takes. Because there'll be some activities that'll drive how long that the project takes, and there'll be some other activities that not so much. And the diagram helps us isolate or focus in on, or helps illustrate those crucial activities. And later on, it allows us to kind of do some, a little bit further analysis, right? Hey, what if we sped up? We have these key activities, these crucial activities. Well, what if we reduce the time for one of these crucial activities, or two of these crucial activities? How will that impact the project? And how much would it cost to do that? And what would the benefits to us doing that be? And then do some little cost benefit analysis to see whether it's worth our while to perhaps reduce the amount of time a given task within those crucial activities, how long that task takes, and then how much is that going to cost us to do that, and then what are any benefits to us for doing that. And then we evaluate whether we should do that or we shouldn't do that. And so very important stuff. So we have these relationships. So we're drawing out these relationships, and by saying precedence relationship, it just means what's the sequence of activities. Okay, and a given activity may not be able to begin until its preceding activities have completed, right? And this sort of makes sense if we think of peanut butter and jam sandwich, for instance. Right? If one of the tasks is to go get the raw materials, i.e. go get the peanut butter, go get the jam, go get the bread, well, we cannot begin spreading the peanut butter on the bread until we actually have the peanut butter and the bread, right? So getting the peanut butter and the bread would be a preceding activity to us actually putting the peanut butter on the bread. The little things like that, but it can get far more complicated than that. But at a basic level, that's essentially what we're trying to establish here. The next thing is, how long does it take, right? Because after all, time is money. It's a cliche, but time is money. And how long things take are important to us because we've got labor involved, we've got equipment tied up on this project perhaps, we've got attention tied up, management focus is tied up on this project. So how long an activity or how long a set of activity takes is important to us. Okay? So we need to estimate how long each one of those activities and by extension the whole project is going to take. Now, how do we come up with how long? Well, we can ask, right? So we have all our forecasting methodologies available to us in this regard, right? So we haven't, although we don't directly use forecasting within this particular unit, it's always lurking in the background. Forecasting is sort of like that thing that's always there, right? We have a number. Where'd that come from? It came from a forecast. Ooh, what about this number? Came from a forecast. We're doing this in constraint management. Came from a forecast, right? So forecasting is kind of like that stuff that's everywhere. Ooh, like a ghost. Very spooky, but very important too. Okay, so maybe we use statistical methodologies. Whether it's judgment method, Salesforce. We talk to the experts. Look at history. Perhaps we do some estimation. Use some quantitative methods to determine how long activities will take. All sorts of things. It's totally wide open to us, depending on what's appropriate for the situation. Okay. And when it gets a high level, very sophisticated stuff, probabilities can play into this. Okay. We won't get into that in detail. If you purchase the textbook, which you did not have to do, you'll notice that they'll talk about beta distributions and so on. That's a very popular distribution used in project management. But there could be others. But beta distribution is sort of the one that's predominantly used out in the so-called world. A little bit beyond the scope of our course here, but doesn't hurt to know that every event has a certain variability to it. Right? And variability is one of our key buzzwords for this entire course, variability and trade-offs. And those activities can be variabilities. Some days some people are working better, some days they're working not so well. Some days the weather is very accommodating, some days the weather really sucks. Right? Okay, and then we have what's called a activity on node approach, and there's some pictures, and I will show you the pictures in a sec, and we will do some examples together. If you have the textbook, it's figure 4.2. If you don't, it's on the next slide. Okay, so don't sweat it if you don't. Okay. So when we see these activity on node or just activities and these precedent relationships, it can get fairly complicated. It can be as simple as going from S. You have to complete S before you can do T. You have to complete T before you do U. And it's just one sequence after another. Okay? In some cases, maybe you have to complete S and T. So 2 activities must be completed before another activity may begin. And that's what you see in the diagram, the second one. Right? S and T both have to be completed. They're both pointing to U, and U cannot begin. Activity U cannot begin until S and T are both completed. Yeah, okay, if S is done but T is done, sorry, T can't begin yet. It needs T to, U can't begin. It needs T to be finished. And then perhaps we have, getting into a little bit more complicated relationships, right? We do activity S. Activity S is a preceding activity to both activity T and activity U. Okay, so once S is completed, T and U may begin. And then V may not begin until T and U are finished. So it's kind of like a combination. And the very first big picture slide on the far left here, we see that S needs to be finished before U can begin, but also that T needs to be finished before activity U can begin, and T needs to be done before activity Victor, can begin as well. Okay, so we have all sorts of set relationships. So it's a very flexible kind of process, a very flexible diagramming tool, right? Because we could represent it in all sorts of ways. Okay? So that completes this particular set. We'll come back, we'll deal with a project, and we will map this example out next.